And let's not forget the children. Being a child in the Middle Ages was an extreme sport. The infant mortality rate was heartbreakingly high. Experts estimate that maybe 30 to 50% of children didn't make it to age 5. It wasn't just the disease. It was the environment. Open fires in the center of the room. Kettles of boiling water. Farm animals are stomping around. Rivers with no fences. A peasant village was a death trap for a toddler. If you made it past childhood, you were put to work almost immediately. There was no adolescence. No teen angst phase where you locked yourself in your room, mostly because there were no locks and only one room. By age 7 or 8, you were doing useful chores. Herding geese. Picking stones out of the fields. Spinning wool. You were a small, slightly uncoordinated economic unit. But despite the hardship, despite the mud and the taxes and the bad teeth, people were still people. They fell in love. They told jokes. They gossiped about the priest's housekeeper. They tried to make their clothes look a little bit nicer with some berry juice dye. They had a sense of fashion, believe it or not. And the nobility hated it. This brings us to the sumptuary laws. These were laws passed by the king to tell people what they were allowed to wear. The nobles were terrified that if peasants started dressing too nicely, no one would be able to tell who was who. The social hierarchy would collapse if a miller looked like a merchant. So, they made rules. Peasants weren't allowed to wear silk. They weren't allowed to wear certain colors, like purple or gold. They weren't allowed to wear fur, unless it was cheap fur like cat or rabbit. They even regulated the length of your shoes. In the late Middle Ages, pointy shoes called polanes became trendy. The points got longer and longer. The king eventually decreed that a commoner could only have a shoe point of 6 inches. A gentleman could have 12. A lord could have 24. Imagine walking around with 2 feet of shoe flapping in front of you just to prove you're rich. It's the medieval equivalent of driving a Hummer. The peasants, of course, ignored these laws whenever they could get away with it. If you had a little extra money, you bought the nice fabric. You wore the brighter blue. You stuck a feather in your hat. It was a quiet rebellion. A way of saying, I might be a serf, but I look good. Let's take a moment to consider the nighttime. When the sun went down, the world changed. There were no streetlights. The countryside was pitch black. And the night was filled with terrors. Peasants were incredibly superstitious. They believed the woods were filled with fairies, goblins, and spirits. And these weren't the cute Tinkerbell kind of fairies. These were malicious tricksters who would curdle your milk, steal your baby, or lead you off a cliff. To protect themselves, they had 1,000,000 little rituals. You hung a horseshoe over the door. You carried a piece of iron. You left a bowl of cream out for the house brownie so he wouldn't trash the kitchen. It was a world where the supernatural was just as real as the natural. The devil wasn't an abstract concept. He was a guy who might meet you at the crossroads and offer you a deal. And then there was the sleep itself. We tend to sleep in one big 8-hour block, hopefully. But medieval people did it differently. They practiced biphasic sleep. They would go to bed when it got dark, sleep for about 4 hours, and then wake up in the middle of the night. This was called the watch. For an hour or so, the whole world was awake in the dark. They would pray, check the fire, maybe do some quiet chores, or just talk to their spouse in the quiet of the night. It was a private, intimate time before the relentless grind of the day started again. Then they'd go back to sleep for a second sleep, until dawn. It sounds kind of nice, doesn't it? A little pause in the darkness. A moment of peace before Baron Reginald's bell starts ringing and the oxen need yoking. Speaking of oxen, let's talk about the relationship between peasants and animals. It was close. We mentioned the animals living in the house, but it went deeper than that. The ox wasn't just a tractor, he was a colleague. You spent more time with your ox than your wife. You knew his moods. You knew exactly where to scratch him behind the ears to get him to pull harder. And the animals had their own folklore. It was believed that on Christmas Eve, at midnight, the animals in the barn would gain the power of speech for 1 hour. They would kneel down and praise the baby Jesus. Of course, it was bad luck to go and listen to them. The stories always said that if a farmer tried to eavesdrop, he'd hear the animals discussing his own death. So, best to just stay in your warm straw bed and let the cows have their moment. Life was a cycle. The seasons turned. The church bells rang. You were born, you worked, you paid taxes, and you died. Soon, people weren't buying the flowers to plant them. They were buying the bulbs to sell them. It was speculation. People sold their houses to buy tulip bulbs. They sold their land. They sold their life savings. At the height of the mania, a single bulb of the Semper Augustus tulip, the most famous one, red and white striped, sold for the price of a Grand Canal house in Amsterdam. One bulb. For a mansion. People were trading contracts for bulbs that were still in the ground. Futures trading. There are stories, some true, some probably exaggerated, of the madness. One story tells of a sailor who arrived at a rich merchant's house. He saw what he thought was an onion on the counter. He was hungry, so he sliced it up and ate it with his herring. It wasn't an onion. It was a Semper Augustus bulb. He had just eaten the equivalent of $1 million for lunch. The merchant was, understandably, upset. The sailor was thrown in jail for eating an onion. Another story tells of an English botanist who was visiting a Dutch friend. He saw a bulb on the table. He took out his knife and started peeling it, dissecting it for science. The Dutchman walked in and asked what he was doing. "I'm examining this most curious hypto," said the botanist. "That," screamed the Dutchman, "is an Admiral van der Eyck." "Is it?" said the Englishman. "Is it common here? It's worth 4,000 florins." The bubble burst in February 1637. It happened almost overnight. Someone at an auction in Haarlem refused to buy. The confidence evaporated. Everyone tried to sell at once. The prices crashed. People who thought they were millionaires woke up to find they owned a bag of onions. The economy took a hit, though not as bad as some legends say. But the psychological blow was real. It was a lesson in human greed. We can convince ourselves that anything has value if everyone else agrees. A rock. A digital image of a monkey. A flower bulb. But eventually, reality asserts itself. And you're left holding the onion. Let's drift from the flowers of Holland to the wigs of France. We are moving into the 18th century now. The era of Versailles. If the medieval peasant was defined by mud, the French courtier was defined by hair. Big hair. Powdered hair. It started with Louis XIV, the Sun King, who went bald and started wearing wigs. Because the king did it, everyone had to do it. By the time we get to Marie Antoinette, things had gotten out of hand. The hairstyles, or poofs, were architectural marvels. They were built on wire frames. They used pads made of horsehair or wool. They were cemented with pomade made from beef tallow, animal fat, and dusted with flour. These structures could be 3 feet high. Women had to kneel on the floor of their carriages because their heads wouldn't fit. But the height wasn't enough. They had to decorate them. Women would wear entire scenes in their hair. A model ship sailing on a wave of curls to celebrate a naval victory. A tiny birdcage with a real bird inside. A pastoral scene with little sheep and a shepherdess. It was walking art. But it was also disgusting. Remember the beef tallow? It's fat. And remember the flour? It's food. So, you are walking around with a head full of fat and flour. In the summer. Without air conditioning. The smell was distinctive. It attracted pests. Mice were known to burrow into the wigs to make nests. It was warm, it was edible, it was safe. There are horror stories of women at dinner parties feeling a scratching sensation, and a mouse poking its nose out of their curls to sniff the soup. They invented scratching sticks, long rods with a claw on the end, so you could itch your scalp without destroying the masterpiece. And they couldn't wash these things. A poof was expensive and took hours to construct. You kept it up for weeks. So, beneath the silk flowers and the pearls and the diamond pins, there was a festering ecosystem of lice, grease, and rodents. Diseases that came along for the ride. typhus, dysentery. Things that a healthy body might fight off, but a body living on tree bark bread has no chance against. And the lords? What was Baron Reginald doing during the Great Famine? Well, he was certainly eating better than the peasants. He had stores of grain in his big stone house. He might have had to cut back on the imported spices or the fancy wines from France, but he wasn't eating his hunting dogs. In fact, some lords saw famine as a business opportunity. When food is scarce, prices skyrocket. If you were a lord with a surplus of grain, you could sell it at ruinous prices to desperate people. Or you could buy up land cheaply from free peasants who had to sell their little plots just to buy a sack of moldy rye. It was disaster capitalism in tunic and hose. The rich got richer, and the poor got dead. Some lords, to be fair, did try to help. They would dole out charity, open their granaries a little bit. It was seen as a Christian duty. But it was never enough to stop the tide. The system just wasn't built to handle a crisis of that magnitude. It was built to maintain the status quo, and the status quo was barely hanging on during good years. Eventually, the weather turned, the sun came out, and the survivors tried to rebuild. The population had taken a massive hit. Whole villages were deserted. The forest started creeping back onto land that had been cleared for centuries. It was a reset button pressed by nature. But if the peasants thought the famine was the worst thing that could happen to them, history had a little surprise waiting just around the corner. A few decades later, something would arrive from the east that made the Great Famine look like a mild inconvenience. Let's float over to the mid-14th century. The year is 1347. The place is Sicily. A few Genoese trading ships pull into the harbor of Messina. The people on the docks probably noticed that the sailors on board weren't looking too good. Most of them were dead, actually. And the ones who were alive were covered in black, oozing swellings. They had brought a hitchhiker with them. Yersinia pestis. The plague. The Black Death. It goes by many names, none of them pleasant. It spread with terrifying speed. From Sicily to mainland Italy. Then France, Spain, and up into England. It didn't care if you were a peasant in a mud hut or a king in a castle. Although, being a peasant in a mud hut, living with rats and fleas, the primary delivery system for the bacteria, certainly didn't help your odds. The arrival of the plague in a village was the stuff of nightmares. You'd hear about it being in the next town over. Then, someone in your village would start coughing up blood, or they'd wake up with a lump in their armpit the size of an apple. These were the buboes, that gave the bubonic plague its name. They were incredibly painful. They'd turn black and eventually burst. If that wasn't enough fun, you'd get a high fever, vomiting, and delirium. It was a very unpleasant way to go. And it was quick. You could be healthy on Tuesday and dead by Friday. The mortality rate was staggering. In some villages, 80% of the people died. 80%. Imagine your neighborhood. Now imagine 4 out of every 5 houses are empty in the span of a few months. The social fabric just completely unraveled. People were terrified. They didn't know what germs were. They thought it was a punishment from God. Or maybe it was bad air, miasmas. Or maybe it was the alignment of Saturn and Jupiter. They had no idea. So, they did what terrified people do. They panicked. Families abandoned their sick relatives. Priests refused to give last rites because they were scared of catching it. The dead piled up faster than they could bury them. They started digging massive plague pits and just stacking the bodies in layers, like a very grim lasagna. For the peasant, daily life, which was already precarious, just stopped. Who's going to plow the fields when half the village is dead and the other half is hiding in the woods? The harvest rotted in the fields again. The animals ran wild because there was no one to tend them. It was an apocalypse in real time. But, in a very dark, ironic twist of history, the Black Death ended up being kind of a good thing for the peasants who survived. I mean, obviously not good for the millions who died. They had a terrible time. But for the survivors, the economic landscape shifted violently in their favor. Suddenly, labor was scarce. Really scarce. Baron Reginald still had all his land, but half his workforce was currently residing in a mass grave. For centuries, the deal had been, there are too many of you peasants, and not enough land, so you'll work for whatever scraps I give you. Now the tables turned. A peasant could look at Baron Reginald and say, "You know, Baron, the lord over at the next manor is offering actual wages. Like silver coins. And he says I don't have to do boon work on Tuesdays. So unless you can beat that offer, I think I'm going to pack up my one tunic and my surviving chicken and head over there." It was a workers' market for the first time in ever. Wages skyrocketed. Parliament in England actually passed laws, the Statute of Labourers in 1351, trying to cap wages at pre-plague levels and stop peasants from moving around to find better deals. They were basically saying, "Stop trying to improve your lives. It's inconvenient for the rich people." So, the city council, in a move that I can only describe as well-intentioned but disastrous, decided to encourage the dancing. They cleared a grain market to make a dance floor. They hired musicians to play drums and pipes to keep the beat going. They even hired strong men to hold the dancers up so they wouldn't fall over. "Dance," they said. "Dance the sickness away." This was, of course, the worst possible advice. The music just made more people join in. It created a feedback loop of mass hysteria. The drumming was hypnotic. The sight of hundreds of people thrashing around was contagious. It went on for weeks. It only stopped when the council realized their mistake. They banned the music. They took the dancers, the ones who were still alive, and loaded them into wagons. They carted them off to a shrine in the mountains dedicated to Saint Vitus. Saint Vitus was the patron saint of dancers and epileptics. They gave the dancers red shoes, because symbolism, and made them pray to the saint. And it worked. The dancing stopped. The survivors went home, probably with very sore calves and a lot of questions. Historians and scientists have spent centuries trying to figure out what happened. Was it ergot poisoning? Ergot is a mold that grows on rye bread. It's basically natural LSD. It can cause convulsions and hallucinations. Maybe. But ergot poisoning usually makes you lose your limbs to gangrene, not do the foxtrot. The most likely explanation is a mass psychogenic illness. Mass hysteria. The people were so stressed, so fearful of God's punishment, that they entered a trance state. They believed Saint Vitus could curse them with a dancing plague, so when one person started, their brains just complied. It was a collective nervous breakdown expressed through interpretive dance. It's a reminder that the human mind is a very fragile thing. If you push a population hard enough with hunger and fear, reality starts to bend. But speaking of bending reality, let's float to another kind of madness. The madness of the sea. Let's leave the sweaty streets of Strasbourg and go to the cold, grey Atlantic. We are boarding a ship. But not a nice ship. We are boarding a ship of fools. Now, the Narrenschiff, or ship of fools, is mostly a metaphorical concept in art and literature. A ship filled with idiots, drifting aimlessly, piloted by a fool. It was a popular satire. But there is some evidence that actual ships of fools existed in a way. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, towns didn't know what to do with their madmen. There were no asylums yet. If someone was mentally ill, they were usually just kept at home by their family. But if they were troublesome, or if they had no family, the town wanted them gone. So sometimes they would put them on a boat. They would pay a captain to take them away. Where are we going? Elsewhere. The ship would sail down the Rhine or the Danube. The passengers were a collection of the unwanted. The delirious, the manic, the melancholic. Drifting from city to city. Sometimes they'd be let off at a pilgrimage site. Sometimes they'd just be dropped in the next town, becoming someone else's problem. It's a haunting image. A boatload of confused souls, floating through the fog, with no destination. Exiled from the solid earth of sanity. But let's get back to dry land. And let's talk about a different kind of obsession. Not dancing, not madness, but tulips. We are in the Netherlands. The year is 1636. The Dutch Golden Age. The Dutch are rich. They have ships sailing all over the world. They have spices, they have silk, they have art. Rembrandt is painting in his studio. It's a good time. And they have discovered a flower. The tulip. It came from the Ottoman Empire. And the Dutch went absolutely insane for it. This is tulip mania, the first recorded economic bubble in history. At first, it was just a status symbol. If you had a garden with rare tulips, you were cool. You were sophisticated. But then, a virus hit the tulips. A mosaic virus. It made the petals develop beautiful, intricate streaks of color. Broken tulips. They were stunning. And they were rare. Prices started to climb. And climb. And climb. The word holiday comes from holy day. And the medieval calendar was packed with them. There were feast days for apostles, martyrs, saints you've never heard of, and saints that might have just been made up by the local bishop to sell souvenirs. On these days, you didn't have to work the fields. In fact, it was a sin to work. So, forced relaxation. The village would gather. There might be a procession. But mostly, there were church alesh. This was basically a fundraising bake sale, but with beer. The churchwardens would brew a massive amount of ale, and the village would buy it and drink it in the churchyard. The profits went to maintain the church building. So, getting hammered was literally an act of charity. It's a business model I'm surprised hasn't made a comeback. These festivals were rowdy. There were games, wrestling matches, bear baiting, which is exactly as awful as it sounds, and football. Medieval football wasn't the organized sport we know today. It was basically a riot with a ball. The entire village might play against the neighboring village. The goal was to get an inflated pig's bladder from one landmark to another, usually miles apart. There were no rules. You could punch, kick, and tackle. People died playing medieval football. Kings tried to ban it constantly because it distracted men from archery practice, but the peasants loved it. It was their one chance to legally hit someone from the next village over. Now, speaking of hitting people, let's talk about law and order. There was no police force. No one to call if someone stole your chicken. Policing was a do-it-yourself activity. It was based on a system called the Frank Pledge. Basically, every man in the village was placed in a group of 10, called a tithing. You were all responsible for each other. If one member of your tithing committed a crime, the rest of you had to turn him in. If you didn't, you all got fined. It was collective punishment, designed to turn everyone into a snitch. If a crime was committed in the open, say you saw someone swipe a loaf of bread, you had to raise the hue and cry. You had to scream, "Thief! Stop!" And everyone within earshot had to drop their tools and chase the guy. If you heard the hue and cry and you just kept plowing, you got fined. If you raised the hue and cry for no reason, just for a laugh, you got fined. Most crimes were handled in the manor court, presided over by Baron Reginald Steward. And the punishment for almost everything was a fine. Assault? Fine. Stealing? Fine. Brewing bad beer? Fine. That was a serious crime, by the way. The ale tasters, or official inspectors who went around testing the quality of the brew. Best job in the Middle Ages. They fined you for everything because the court was a revenue stream for the lord. It wasn't really about justice. It was about income. But for serious crimes, murder, treason, arson, you had the king's court. And that's where things got hanged, drawn, and quartered. We won't go into detail there because we're trying to stay relaxed, but let's just say the justice system wasn't interested in rehabilitation. One of the more bizarre aspects of medieval law was that animals could be put on trial. I'm not joking. If a pig wandered into a house and bit a child, the pig would be arrested. It would be put in jail. It would get a lawyer. It would be tried in court. Witnesses would be called to testify about the pig's character. Yes, Your Honor, that sow has always had a shifty look in her eye. If found guilty, the pig would be executed. Sometimes they'd even dress the pig in human clothes for the execution. It was a way of imposing order on a chaotic world. They couldn't accept that accidents just happened. Everything had to fit into a legal framework, even the livestock. Let's float over to the domestic sphere. The peasant family. We have this idea that people in the past married young. And for the nobility, that was true. Kings were marrying off 6-year-olds to secure treaties. But for peasants? Not so much. Peasants usually waited until their mid-20s to marry. Why? Because you couldn't get married until you had a way to support a family. You needed land. You needed a cottage. You had to wait for your parents to retire or die, or for a plot of land to become available. So you had a lot of young adults living at home, working for their parents, waiting for their turn to start their lives. It was surprisingly modern in that regard. Marriage wasn't really about romance. I mean, if you liked your spouse, that was a nice bonus, like finding an extra onion in your pottage. But mostly, marriage was an economic partnership. A peasant farm couldn't run with just one person. You needed a partner. The division of labor was strict but essential. The man usually did the heavy field work, plowing, reaping. The woman was in charge of the inner economy. She managed the garden, the chickens, the brewing of ale, the baking of bread, the making of clothes, and the raising of children. In many ways, she was the CEO of the household. If she was bad at her job, the family starved just as surely as if the man failed at his. So, while your grain was potentially wilting, you were up at the big house making sure the baron's grain looked nice and healthy. Because his needs came first. Obviously. He had a reputation to maintain at the local tournaments. But the fun didn't stop with just labor. There were the taxes. The medieval world was incredibly creative when it came to squeezing things out of peasants. There was the Harriet, which was a death tax. When the head of a peasant household died, the lord got the best animal they owned. So your dad dies, and then Baron Reginald shows up to take your best cow. Just to really kick you while you're down. There was Merchet, a fine you had to pay to the lord if your daughter wanted to get married outside the manor. Because you were depriving the lord of future little worker bees. And then there were the banalities. These were fees you had to pay to use the lord's infrastructure. You couldn't just grind your grain into flour at home with a couple of rocks. That was illegal. You had to take it to the lord's mill. And the miller, who worked for the lord, would take a cut of your grain as payment. Usually a larger cut than was strictly necessary, because everyone loves a middleman. You had to use the lord's oven to bake your bread. For a fee. You had to use the lord's wine press. For a fee. It was like living in a theme park where every single ride cost extra, and you couldn't leave the park, and the rides were just grinding grain. Speaking of grain, let's talk about the diet. It was repetitive. If you like carbohydrates boiled in water, boy, was the Middle Ages the time for you. The staple was pottage, which is just a thick soup or stew. It was ragingly popular because you could leave it simmering over the fire all day while you were out working in the mud. The base was usually grain, oats, barley, rye. Then you'd throw in whatever vegetables you managed to grow in your little garden patch. Onions, leeks, cabbage. Peas and beans were huge because they were filling and had some protein. If you were having a really good week, you might toss in a bit of bacon fat for flavor. But actual meat was a rarity. Meat was for special occasions, feast days, or when a cow happened to die of natural causes before you could sell it. They grew a lot of wheat, the good stuff that makes nice, fluffy white bread. But they didn't eat it. That was a cash crop. That went to the lord, or it went to the market to be sold to city folk. The peasants ate the dark bread. The bread made from rye and barley. It was dense, heavy, and probably gave your jaw a real workout. It was fuel, not cuisine. Water was generally considered unsafe to drink, because people threw everything into rivers. Including, themselves and their waste. So, everyone drank weak ale or cider. Even the kids. It wasn't enough to get you hammered, usually, just enough to kill the bacteria and make the endless drudgery slightly more tolerable. It was a baseline level of hydration-based buzzing that kept the medieval world turning. So, you have this life of intense physical labor, a diet consisting mostly of beige sludge, and a landlord who charges you every time you sneeze. It wasn't exactly a recipe for robust health. You were always teetering on the edge of disaster. A bad harvest wasn't just an economic downturn, it was a potential death sentence. If the rains came too early and rotted the grain in the fields, that was it. There was no supermarket to go to. There was no government aid package. This brings us to the first major horseman of the peasant apocalypse: famine. Famines weren't rare events. They were periodic adjustments to the population. Localized food shortages happened all the time. But sometimes the weather would turn against the whole continent for years at a time. The Great Famine of the early 14th century, starting around 1315, is a prime example of everything going wrong at once. It started raining in the spring of 1315, and it basically just didn't stop for about 2 years. It was biblical levels of rain. The crops rotted in the ground. The hay couldn't be dried to feed the animals in winter. The saltworks on the coasts couldn't evaporate seawater, so there was a shortage of salt to preserve the little meat that was available. It was a cascading failure of the entire medieval support system. And when the food ran out, things got dark very quickly. At first, people ate their seed grain, the grain they were supposed to save to plant next year. That's the desperation phase. You're borrowing from a future you probably won't see. Then they ate the animals. The chickens, the pigs. Then the valuable work animals, the oxen and the horses. Which meant even if the weather got better, they couldn't plow the fields effectively. When the livestock was gone, they turned to other things. Dogs. Cats. Rats. There are reports of people eating moss. Trying to make bread out of tree bark. It's amazing what the human body will try to digest when the alternative is starving. The chroniclers of the time, mostly monks sitting in slightly less damp monasteries, wrote some pretty horrific accounts. They talk about the roads being lined with people weak from hunger, just lying down to die. They talk about parents abandoning their children because they couldn't stand to watch them starve. It was a slow-motion disaster. Famine doesn't kill you quickly. It weakens you first. Your immune system packs it in. So usually, it wasn't actual starvation that killed the most people. It didn't really work. You can't legislate against supply and demand when the supply of labor has been cut in half. The peasants had leverage. They started eating better. More meat, less beige pottage. They started wearing slightly better clothes. They realized that the system wasn't set in stone. It was a small silver lining on a very, very large, black, flea-infested cloud. But let's step back from the big disasters for a moment and return to the quiet, everyday dangers, because you didn't need a global pandemic to die young in the Middle Ages. You just needed, say, a toothache, doctors, deities, and the daily grind. So, let's pick up right where we left off. You're a medieval peasant, you've survived the famine, you've dodged the plague, but now you have a throbbing pain in your lower molar. In the modern world, you'd call a dentist, listen to some elevator music, and get it fixed. In the 14th century, you had fewer options, and all of them were bad. You see, medicine back then was strictly divided. You had the university-trained physicians. These were men who had read a lot of books written by ancient Greeks who had been dead for 1,000 years. They knew a lot about astrology and philosophy, but they generally considered touching a patient to be beneath them. Manual labor was for peasants, after all. So, for your toothache, you didn't go to a physician. You went to the barber surgeon. Yes, the same guy who trimmed your beard also amputated limbs. It was a one-stop shop for all your sharp blade needs. The red and white striped pole you see outside barber shops today? That represents blood and bandages. It's a nice little nostalgic reminder of the time when a haircut might come with a side of bloodletting. For your tooth, the barber surgeon wouldn't have Novocaine. He had a pair of pliers that looked like they belonged in a dungeon, because they often did, and maybe a stiff drink, if he was feeling generous. He'd just yank it out. If you were lucky, the infection wouldn't spread to your jaw and kill you. If you were unlucky, well, at least you wouldn't have to worry about the harvest anymore. The underlying theory of medicine was based on the four humors. This was the idea that the human body was a bag of fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To be healthy, these four had to be in perfect balance. If you were sick, it meant you had too much of one of them. And since they couldn't exactly put more bile back in, the solution was almost always to take something out. Usually blood. Fever? Too much blood. Headache? Too much blood. Broken leg? Probably unrelated to the blood volume, but let's drain a pint just to be safe. People were bled for everything. It was the medieval equivalent of, "Take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning." Monks were bled regularly just as a preventative measure, which probably explains why they were always having visions. It wasn't divine intervention, it was lightheadedness. If the barber surgeon wasn't your speed, you could visit the local wise woman. She was usually an older peasant woman who knew which herbs might stop a fever and which ones would make you see dragons. She was actually probably more effective than the university doctors because she was using practical remedies passed down for generations. Willow bark for pain, which is basically aspirin. Honey for wounds, which is antibacterial. But she had to be careful. If she cured you, she was a helpful neighbor. If she failed, or if your cow died the next day, she might get accused of witchcraft. It was a high-risk, low-reward career path. But let's drift away from the medical horrors and look at the spiritual ones. Because the church was the other landlord in your life. If Baron Reginald owned your body, the church owned your soul. And they were very specific about the rent. The parish church was the center of the village. It was usually the only stone building besides the manor house. It was where you were baptized, where you got married, and where you were buried. It was the alpha and the omega of your existence. And it was expensive. Everyone, from the richest lord to the poorest serf, had to pay the tithe. That's 10% of everything you produced. 10% of your wheat, 10% of your eggs, 10% of the wool you sheared. The priest would come by the field to make sure you weren't hiding the good sheaves of wheat at the bottom of the stack. You couldn't cheat God, and more importantly, you couldn't cheat the bishop. This produce was stored in a massive tithe barn. It was supposed to support the priest and help the poor, but a lot of it ended up funding the construction of massive cathedrals in cities you would never visit. So, while you were shivering in your mud hut, your grain was helping to pay for a really nice stained glass window in York. But the church wasn't all taxes and guilt. It was also the source of the only entertainment you were likely to get. Young Ivan heard the commotion and ran in. He screamed at his father. "You sent my first wife to a convent! You sent my second wife to a convent! And now you beat my third wife and kill the child she carries!" It was a brave thing to say. The Tsar didn't take criticism well. He had a staff in his hand, a heavy iron-tipped staff. In a fit of blind rage, he swung it. He didn't mean to kill him. It was just a reflex of violence. But the staff hit young Ivan in the temple. The prince fell. And instantly, the rage vanished. The Tsar dropped the staff. He threw himself on his son's body. He tried to stop the bleeding with his hands. He kissed his face. He screamed, "I have killed my son! I have killed my son!" It's the subject of a famous painting by Repin. The Tsar's eyes are wide with horror, hugging the dying body of his heir. Young Ivan died a few days later. And with that blow, Ivan the Terrible killed his own dynasty. His only other son was Fifer, who was, let's say, a gentle soul. Fifer was more interested in ringing church bells than ruling an empire. When Ivan finally died, while playing chess of all things, he left Russia in chaos. The time of troubles followed famine, civil war, and pretenders to the throne. It was a mess that would last until a new family took over. The family of Ivan's first, beloved wife. The Romanovs. So the wheel turned. But we can leave Ivan to his chess game. We can leave the snow falling on the red square. It's getting late. The candles are burning down. Let's drift again. Away from the cold. Away from the palaces. The ship of fools and the dancing maniacs. So, we've covered the genetic dead ends of Spain and the frozen rages of Russia. We've seen what happens when kings have too much power and not enough self-control. But tonight, let's drift away from the individuals. Let's float back down to the crowd. Because sometimes, history isn't about one crazy guy on a throne. Sometimes, it's about a whole town going crazy at the exact same time. We are drifting to the city of Strasbourg. The year is 1518. It's July. It's hot. The air is thick and humid. The people of Strasbourg are hungry. There's been a bad harvest, again, and syphilis is starting to creep into the population. Everyone is stressed. The anxiety level is just vibrating. And then, a woman named Frau Trophia walks out of her house. She walks into a narrow street. And she starts to dance. Now, this wasn't a, "Yay, it's Friday," dance. There was no music. Her face wasn't happy. It was blank. Or maybe grimacing. She was stepping from foot to foot, twirling, jerking her arms. She danced for hours. Her husband came out and told her to stop. She didn't. She couldn't. She danced until she collapsed from exhaustion. Then she slept for a few hours, woke up, and started dancing again. By the third day, her feet were bleeding. Her shoes were soaked through. And here is the weird part. Other people started joining in. They weren't trying to help her. They were catching it. Within a week, 30 people were dancing. Within a month, there were 400. This is the dancing plague of 1518. And it is one of the most bizarre events in recorded history. Imagine a flash mob, but it's a horror movie, and nobody can stop. These people weren't having fun. They were screaming in pain. They were begging for mercy. But their legs just kept moving. They were literally dancing themselves to death. People started dying of heart attacks, strokes, and sheer exhaustion. They would drop dead mid-jig. The city council of Strasbourg was panicked. They didn't know what to do. They consulted the doctors. The doctors, using their classic medieval logic, said, "Oh, this is hot blood. Their brains are overheated. The only way to cure them is to let them dance it out." It's a perfect metaphor for the Ancien regime, isn't it? On the outside, towering, magnificent, sparkling. On the inside, rotting, itchy, and full of vermin. And we all know how that story ended. The guillotine didn't care about the hairstyle. It chopped through the poof just as easily as it chopped through the neck. But before the revolution, there was the boredom. Life at Versailles was incredibly boring. It was a gilded cage. To pass the time, the nobles came up with strange hobbies. One of the weirdest trends was the ribbon of honor. Actually, no, that's too normal. Let's talk about the trend of having a hermit. This was more of an English trend, but the French dabbled too. Rich landowners would build a hermitage in their garden, a little fake cave or a rustic hut. And then, they would hire a man to live in it. They would place an ad in the newspaper. Wanted hermit. Must be willing to live in a cave for 7 years. No talking. No washing. No cutting hair or nails. Must wear a robe and look wise. The pay was good. If you lasted the 7 years, you got a pension. But the rules were strict. You were a garden ornament. Guests would come for a dinner party, and the host would say, "Shall we take a stroll to see my hermit?" And they'd walk down to the cave, and there would be this poor guy, looking miserable and bearded, sitting at a table with a skull and a Bible. "Oh, look at him," the ladies would say. "How philosophical." And the hermit would just grunt. Most hermits didn't last the 7 years. They'd get caught sneaking out to the pub. Or they'd just quit because, living in a damp cave is terrible. It shows the level of detachment the rich had. People were props. Poverty was an aesthetic. I want a rugged, spiritual vibe for the garden, so let's pay a guy to be homeless in the corner. It's funny, but it's also deeply weird. Let's drift back to the peasants for a second. Just to ground ourselves. While the ladies were wearing ships in their hair and the lords were hiring garden hermits, the peasants were still there. Still farming. Still paying taxes. But their lives were changing too. New things were arriving. The potato. We take the potato for granted. It's a fry. It's a chip. It's mash. But when it first arrived from the Americas, Europeans were suspicious. It grows underground? Like the devil? It looks like a leprosy lump. It's not mentioned in the Bible. People refused to eat them. They thought they caused leprosy, or lust, or the plague. In France, a man named Antoine-Augustin Parmentier decided to rebrand the potato. He knew it was a superfood. It could stop famines. So, he planted a field of potatoes near Paris. And he stationed armed guards around it during the day. The peasants looked at the guards. Ooh, armed guards. Those must be very valuable vegetables. Then, at night, Parmentier ordered the guards to leave. Naturally, the peasants snuck in and stole the potatoes. They planted them in their own gardens. Because if the king is guarding it, it must be good. Reverse psychology saved Europe from starvation. By the 19th century, the potato was the staple crop. Especially in Ireland. Which, sadly, set the stage for the next great tragedy, the potato famine. But that's a story for a sadder night. For now, let's stick to the weird. Let's float to the year 1816. The year without a summer. A volcano had erupted in Indonesia, Mount Tambora. It was huge. It threw so much ash into the atmosphere that it blocked the sun. In Europe and America, it snowed in June. Crops failed. Birds dropped dead from the sky. The sky was a weird, sickly yellow color. Here, the floors are marble. The tapestries are silk. The dinner plates are solid gold. And the people, well, the people are falling apart. We are entering the world of the Habsburgs. Specifically, the Spanish Habsburgs. This was a family that dominated Europe for centuries. They had a very famous motto. Bella gerent alii, tu felix Austria nub, which translates to, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. It was a brilliant strategy. Instead of fighting for land, they just married the person who owned it. It worked incredibly well. They acquired Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, the Americas. They owned half the world. But there was a catch. To keep all this land in the family, they had to keep the family in the family. They didn't want to marry outsiders, because that would mean splitting up the inheritance. So, they started marrying cousins. And then double cousins. And then uncles started marrying nieces. It became a closed loop. A genetic cul-de-sac. Their family tree didn't branch, it just went straight up like a telephone pole. And the result of all this strategic matrimony was a man named Charles II of Spain. Or, as he was known to his people, El Hechizado. The Hexed. The Bewitched. Poor Charles. He is perhaps the most tragic example of keeping it in the family in human history. Let's just visualize him for a moment. He was born in 1661. His father was Philip IV of Spain. His mother was Mariana of Austria. Here is the math. Philip was Mariana's uncle. Mariana was Philip's niece. But it gets worse. Philip's mother and Mariana's mother were sisters. And their fathers were first cousins. If you run the numbers, the coefficient of inbreeding, Charles II was more inbred than if his parents had been brother and sister. He was a genetic experiment that went horribly, predictably wrong. When he was born, the court was ecstatic. A male heir! The dynasty is saved! Then they looked at him. The ambassadors from other countries wrote letters home that were polite, but concerned. They noted that the baby had a very large head. And he seemed weak. And he had the Habsburg jaw. Now, the Habsburg jaw is famous. It's a condition called mandibular prognathism. The lower jaw grows faster than the upper jaw. It juts out. Most of the Habsburgs had it to some degree. It was their trademark look. If you see a portrait of a king who looks like he could open a can of tuna with his chin, that's a Habsburg. But Charles had it to an extreme. His lower jaw stuck out so far that his teeth didn't meet. He couldn't chew his food. He had to swallow everything whole, like a snake. This led to chronic indigestion, naturally. His tongue was also too large for his mouth, so he drooled constantly, and could barely speak. When he did speak, he mumbled so badly that even his tutors couldn't understand him. But the physical problems were just the start. The poor kid didn't learn to walk until he was 8 years old. He didn't speak until he was 4. He was breastfed until he was 5 or 6, just to keep him alive. His childhood was a series of illnesses. Smallpox, measles, chickenpox, rubella. He caught everything. He was always on the verge of death. And how did the royal doctors treat this fragile, confused little boy? Did they give him fresh air and exercise? Did they give him gentle physical therapy? Of course not. They treated him like a porcelain doll that was also possessed by demons. They kept him indoors. They wrapped him in wool. They refused to wash him because they thought water was bad for his humors. So he was covered in rashes and sores. And because he was so developmentally delayed, they assumed it was witchcraft. Because obviously it couldn't be the fact that his family tree was a wreath. It had to be a curse. So they brought in exorcists. Imagine being a confused, sickly child, and instead of a doctor, a guy in a robe comes in and starts shouting Latin at you and splashing you with holy water to drive out the devil. It probably didn't help his anxiety. Despite all this, or maybe in spite of it, Charles survived childhood. Which surprised everyone. The French ambassador wrote to Louis XIV, basically saying, "Don't worry, he's going to die any minute now, and then we can take over Spain." But Charles kept breathing. He became king at the age of 4 when his father died. Obviously, he didn't rule. His mother ruled for him. And his mother, Mariana, she wasn't having a great time either. She was surrounded by sharks. Everyone at court was just waiting for Charles to die so they could carve up the empire. Let's float through the daily life of this adult king. Charles believed it. He was convinced he was full of dead man's brains. He stopped eating. He stopped taking his medicine. He just lay in bed, waiting for the end. The court descended into chaos. The French faction and the Austrian faction were literally fighting in the hallways over who would inherit the throne. The king was still alive, but they were already measuring the curtains. In the year 1700, Charles finally gave up the ghost. He was 38 years old, but his body was that of a man of 90. His last words were apparently, "I heard all over," which is just heartbreakingly simple. When the doctors performed the autopsy, they were horrified. The report is famous. It states, "His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous, he had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water." Basically, the man was a walking biological collapse. He shouldn't have been alive for 38 minutes, let alone 38 years. With his death, the Spanish Habsburg line ended. It just fizzled out. 2 centuries of power, gold, and empire, ending in a small room with a man who couldn't chew. It led, of course, to the War of the Spanish Succession. Because nobody could agree on who should get the keys to the kingdom. Europe spent the next 14 years tearing itself apart to figure out who got Spain. But for Charles, the suffering was finally over. The happy Austria marriage strategy had achieved its final, ironic victory. It had created a king so pure-blooded that he ceased to function as a human being. Let's float away from the gloomy Alcazar now. Let's leave the smell of incense and rotting tapestry behind. It's a heavy story, but it serves as a nice reminder that nature has rules. And you can have all the gold in the Americas, you can have armies and fleets and crowns, but if you ignore biology, biology will eventually catch up with you. And it will bring a very large jaw. Let's drift a little further north now. Away from the inbreeding, and towards something a little more volatile. We're going to float over to Russia. To a time before the Romanovs became the polished, fabergé-collecting dynasty we know. We are going back to the start. Or rather, the man who made the start possible by being absolutely terrifying. Ivan. The Terrible. But not the Ivan you're thinking of. We're going to talk about his domestic life. Because if you thought the Habsburgs had family issues, wait until you meet the Tsars. Imagine a cold wind blowing across the steppes. Snow falling on the onion domes of Moscow. It's the 16th century. And the Tsar is feeling irritable. But before we dive into the snow, let's just pause for a second. Let the image of the Spanish court fade. The velvet, the gold, the silence of the crypt. Take a breath. Now picture a wooden palace, creaking in the frost. Fur robes, tall hats, beards that go down to the waist. Ivan Vasilyevic, was the first man to call himself Tsar of all the Russias. Tsar comes from Caesar. He was claiming to be the heir of Rome. He was intelligent. He was devout. He composed music. He wrote prayers. He also had a temper that could melt stone. But the thing about Ivan is, he wasn't born terrible. He was made terrible. His childhood makes Charles II look like a picnic. Charles was pampered to death. Ivan was neglected to the point of abuse. His father died when he was 3. His mother died when he was 8, probably poisoned by the boyars, the Russian nobles. So, little Ivan grew up an orphan in his own palace. The boyars were technically ruling in his name, but they treated him like dirt. They would mock him. They would starve him. They would wear his dead father's clothes and put their feet up on his father's bed. Ivan remembered all of this. He was a quiet, brooding child who watched everything. He saw the violence, the treachery, the poison. And he took notes. He learned that the only way to survive was to strike first. And strike hard. As a teenager, he started to show his hobbies. He liked to drop dogs from the palace towers to watch them fall. It was a red flag. A very big, barking red flag. But at 17, he declared himself Tsar. And he decided to get married. Now, usually, a royal marriage is a diplomatic arrangement. You marry the princess of Poland or Sweden. But Ivan didn't trust foreigners. And he didn't trust the high nobles. You have to remember, heating water was a massive pain. You had to fetch the water from the well, bucket by bucket. Then you had to heat it in a cauldron over a fire. Then you had to pour it into a wooden tub. If you were a peasant, you probably didn't have a big wooden tub. You might wash your face and hands every morning. You might wash your feet after a day in the fields. But a full-body soak was a luxury. However, in the towns, there were public bathhouses. They were called stews. You could pay a penny to go and soak in a big communal tub with a bunch of strangers. It sounds hygienic, but the water wasn't changed between customers. So you were basically sitting in a human soup. And the stews had a reputation. They were often fronts for other kinds of business. Brothels, essentially. The church hated them. They eventually closed a lot of them down because they thought bathing led to immorality. Which, to be fair, in the stews it often did. But what about soap? Did they have soap? Yes. Soft soap. It was made from animal fat and wood ash. It was a caustic, brown, jelly-like substance. It was great for getting grease off a pot, but if you used it on your skin, it would probably take the top layer of dermis with it. For laundry, they had a secret weapon. A cleaning agent that was free, abundant, and completely organic. Urine. Stale urine produces ammonia. Ammonia is a great bleaching agent. So, every household would have a pot to collect the family's urine. On laundry day, the washerwomen would fill a tub with clothes and stale urine, and then they would stomp on it with their bare feet. Like making wine, but much, much worse. So, when you picture a pristine medieval maiden waving a white handkerchief from a tower, just remember, that handkerchief was probably washed in pee. It really ruins the romantic aesthetic, doesn't it? Let's drift over to fashion. Because even peasants wanted to look good. We talked about the sumptuary laws, but there were other beauty standards that seem odd to us. For women, a high forehead was the height of beauty. It was considered elegant. So, women would pluck their hairlines back. Sometimes an inch or 2. They wanted their face to look like a nice, smooth egg. They would also pluck their eyebrows off completely. And their eyelashes. The goal was to look as featureless and pale as possible. Pale skin was a status symbol. It meant you didn't have to work outside in the sun. Peasants, who were naturally tanned from, surviving, tried to emulate this. They would use mixtures of flour or chalk to whiten their faces. If they were wealthy enough to buy cosmetics, they might use ceruse, which was a white lead paint. It gave you a lovely, smooth, white complexion. It also gave you lead poisoning. It made your hair fall out, your teeth rot, and your brain melt. But hey, beauty is pain. And speaking of hair falling out, let's talk about the lice. Everyone had lice. Even the king had lice. It was just a fact of life. There were specialized combs made of bone or wood with very fine teeth to scrape them out. People would sit by the fire in the evening and groom each other. It was a social activity. Hey, honey, come over here and pick the parasites off my scalp. It was a bonding experience. Now, let's float to the end of the day. The sun has set. You've washed your face, maybe? You've checked your spouse for bugs. You've had your bowl of pottage. It's dark. And in the medieval mind, the dark was where the dead lived. Death was everywhere. We tried to hide death in hospitals and funeral homes. In the Middle Ages, death was in your living room. You washed the bodies of your family members. You dug their graves. Because life was so fragile, they had a very different relationship with mortality. They didn't ignore it, they obsessed over it. There was a whole genre of art called memento mori. Remember, you will die. You'd see paintings of healthy, young people looking into a mirror and seeing a skull looking back. Or a corpse rotting in a grave. It wasn't meant to be depressing. It was meant to be a reminder. Don't be arrogant. Don't be greedy. You're going to be worm food soon, just like everyone else. This culminated in the danse macabre, the dance of death. This was a popular motif in church murals. It showed a long line of skeletons dancing. And they were dancing with everyone. A skeleton leading a pope. A skeleton leading a king. A skeleton leading a merchant, a peasant, a child. The message was clear: death is the great equalizer. Baron Reginald might have a stone castle and a velvet coat, but he looks exactly like the peasant when the skin comes off. But there was one group of people who existed outside this normal hierarchy. The outcasts. The wanderers. The people who had no master. In a society where everyone had a place, having no place was dangerous. If you were a vagabond, a masterless man, you were viewed with deep suspicion. You were a threat to the order of things. But for some, that freedom was worth the risk. Minstrels, jugglers, pilgrims. They moved along the dusty roads, bringing news from far away, bringing songs, bringing a glimpse of a wider world to the isolated villages. Imagine being a peasant who has never traveled more than 10 miles from where you were born. And then, one evening, a stranger walks into the village inn, which is really just a neighbor's house that brews extra beer. He has a lute. He's wearing strange, colorful clothes. And he starts singing a song about a hero named Robin Hood. A yeoman who lives in the forest, who answers to no lord, who steals from the rich and gives to the poor. The baron up in the castle hated those songs. But down in the village, over a cup of weak ale, those songs were electric. They were a reminder that maybe, just maybe, Baron Reginald wasn't invincible. That maybe the rules could be broken. But for tonight, the fire is dying down. The ale is finished. The ox is sleeping in the corner. And the only thing we have to worry about is waking up when the rooster crows. Let's drift further down the timeline now, towards the twilight of the Middle Ages, where things start to get even stranger. The rebellion of the unwashed. Hey guys. Welcome back to the mud. If you're just joining us, or if you've been drifting in and out of consciousness while we discuss the finer points of medieval manure management, we are currently deep in the 14th century. We've covered the plague, the famine, and the general unpleasantness of having a landlord who owns your physical person. But as we move toward the late 1300s, something shifted in the air. A little static charge of resentment. You see, after the Black Death wiped out half the workforce, the surviving peasants started to realize they had value. It's a basic economic principle, supply and demand. The supply of peasants was low. The demand for wheat was high. Therefore, The peasant was suddenly a hot commodity. But the nobility, being the nobility, didn't want to pay market rates. They wanted the old, work for free and be grateful I don't beat you rates. They passed laws to freeze wages. They tried to turn the clock back to 1346. And then, the government did the one thing you should never do when everyone is already grumpy and owns a pitchfork. They introduced a new tax. The poll tax of 1381. Now, taxes are never popular. We all know this. But the poll tax was special. It wasn't a percentage of what you earned. It was a flat fee. Every adult had to pay the same amount, whether you were a wealthy merchant with a velvet coat or a shepherd with one shoe. It was essentially a tax on existing. The government sent out commissioners to collect this money. And let's just say, the reception was chilly. It started in a little village in Essex. The tax collector showed up, opened his book, and demanded payment. The villagers, led by a man named Thomas Baker, basically said, "No. In fact, we've already paid, and even if we hadn't, we wouldn't pay you because you're terrible." The tax collector tried to arrest them. The villagers chased him out of town. This sparked the Peasants Revolt. And it wasn't just a chaotic riot. It was surprisingly organized. It was like the peasants had a secret WhatsApp group they'd been waiting to use. They marched on London. Thousands of them. From Essex and Kent. They were led by a man named Wat Tyler. We don't know much about Wat. He might have been a tiler of roofs, hence the name, or he might have just been a guy with a lot of charisma and a very loud voice. They also had a spiritual leader, a priest named John Ball. John Ball had been preaching some very radical ideas for a long time. He had a famous rhyme. "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Translation: when Adam was digging in the garden and Eve was spinning wool, where were the nobles? Where were the barons? We are all descended from the same two people. So why is Baron Reginald drinking wine in a castle while I'm eating turnip stew in a ditch? It was a good question. The Archbishop of Canterbury didn't like it. He had John Ball thrown in prison. The rebels broke him out. So, this army of farmers, ditch diggers, and disgruntled taxpayers marched to London. And the amazing thing is, the city let them in. The people of London lowered the drawbridge on London Bridge. They were sympathetic. They hated the king's advisors too. So he held a bride show. This is exactly what it sounds like. A beauty pageant. A casting call for a queen. He sent out a decree. Bring me the most beautiful virgins in Russia. Thousands of girls were brought to Moscow. They were screened by doctors and midwives. They were whittled down to a few hundred. Then a few dozen. Finally, Ivan walked through the room and chose Anastasia Romanovna. She wasn't a princess. She was from a minor noble family. The Romanovs. Keep that name in mind, it becomes important later. And here is the twist, Ivan actually loved her. By all accounts, Anastasia was the one person who could calm him down. When he was in a rage, foaming at the mouth, she would put a hand on his arm, and he would settle. She was his anchor. They were happy. They had children. For 13 years, Ivan was actually a pretty good czar. He reformed the laws, he expanded the borders. He was Ivan the Awesome. But remember where we are. We are in the Russian court. And happy endings aren't really a thing here. In 1560, Anastasia got sick. She grew weaker and weaker. And then she died. Ivan was broken. He threw himself on her coffin. He howled like a wounded animal. He had to be dragged away. And then, the paranoia set in. He was convinced, and modern science suggests he might have been right, that the boyars had poisoned her. That they had taken the only thing he loved. The anchor was gone. And the ship drifted out into a storm of madness. Ivan left Moscow. He just packed up and quit. He sent a letter saying, "I'm done. You people are terrible. I abdicate." The people of Moscow panicked. They begged him to come back. "Come back, Father Tsar. We need you." Ivan said, "Okay. I'll come back. But on one condition. I get absolute power to punish anyone I want, without trial, without question. And I get my own personal territory, the Oprichnina. They agreed. They signed the deal with the devil. And that is when Ivan became the Terrible. He created a secret police force called the Oprichniki. They dressed all in black. They rode black horses. And they tied a severed dog's head and a broom to their saddles. The dog's head meant, "We sniff out treason," and the broom meant, "We sweep it away." Subtle, right? They terrorized the country. But let's focus on Ivan's personal life, because that was becoming a disaster zone. He needed a new wife. He tried the bride show again. He married Maria Temryakovna. She was a Circassian princess. She was wild, beautiful, and apparently loved to watch executions with him. A match made in, well, not heaven. But she died too. Poisoned? Maybe. Or maybe just the stress of living with a man who slept with a spear under his pillow. Then came wife number 3. Martha. She died 2 weeks after the wedding. Ivan was convinced she was poisoned. He tortured her family to death. Wife number 4. Anna. The church was getting annoyed now. You're only supposed to marry 3 times max in the Orthodox faith. Ivan said. The third one didn't count because we never consummated it. The church sighed and said, Fine. Anna lasted 2 years. Sent to a convent. Wife number 5. Anna, another one. Sent to a convent. Wife number 6. Vasilisa. Sent to a convent because he caught her looking at another man. Wife number 7. Maria. It became a revolving door of queens. Being chosen by Ivan wasn't a fairy tale. It was a death sentence. But the worst tragedy, the one that really defines his legacy, happened with his son. Ivan had a son, also named Ivan. Young Ivan was the heir. He was strong, capable, and very much like his father. They argued constantly. One night, in 1581, the Tsar saw his son's pregnant wife walking through the palace. He decided she wasn't dressed modestly enough. She was probably wearing 2 layers of robes instead of 3. Scandalous. He started screaming at her. He started beating her. It was the apocalypse again. In Switzerland, a group of friends were on vacation. But the weather was so bad they couldn't go outside. It was raining and thundering constantly. They were bored. Stuck in a villa by Lake Geneva. The group included Lord Byron, the famous poet, and mad, bad, and dangerous to know, Percy Shelley, and his girlfriend, Mary, and Byron's doctor, John Polidori. To pass the time, they read ghost stories. And then Byron said, Let's each write a ghost story. Byron wrote a fragment about a vampire. Polidori took that idea and wrote The Vampire, which basically invented the modern vampire genre. Before that, vampires were just gross peasants rising from the grave. Polidori made them aristocratic and seductive. But Mary was only 18. She was struggling to come up with an idea. Then she had a waking dream. She imagined a pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. A hideous phantasm of a man, stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, shows signs of life. She wrote Frankenstein. So, because a volcano erupted in Indonesia, causing bad weather in Switzerland, we have the 2 greatest monsters in horror history, the vampire and the monster. It's the butterfly effect in action. Or the volcano effect. It's strange to think that our culture is shaped by these random accidents. If it had been a sunny summer, they might have just gone for a picnic, and we'd have no Frankenstein. The world is a web of these connections. The potato, the volcano, the wig, the tulip. Everything touches everything else. And we are just drifting through it all. Observing. The candle is getting very low now. The shadows are getting long. We've traveled a long way tonight. From the medieval mud to the palaces of Spain, to the frozen steppes of Russia, to the tulip fields of Holland. We've seen that humans are resilient. We are creative. We are greedy. We are foolish. And we are very, very strange. But mostly, we are just trying to survive, Whether it's surviving a plague, a bad king, or a boredom-induced ghost story contest. So, as you lay there, in the safety of the modern world, where the potatoes are plentiful and the dentists have painkillers, just let your mind drift. You don't have to plow the field tomorrow. You don't have to guard the king's sleep. You don't have to worry about the Inquisition. You just have to sleep. Let the history fade into a hum. A background noise of time. Baron Reginald is gone. Ivan is gone. The tulip market has crashed. It's all quiet. Rest now. The history book is closed. The library is dark. Good night. He was short, lame, epileptic, and prematurely senile. By the time he was 30, he looked like an old man. He had almost no hair. He had no teeth. He was constantly hallucinating. His days were spent in the dark, gloomy corridors of the Alcazar in Madrid. It was a fortress, not a palace. Thick walls, small windows. He liked to play games that were meant for very small children. He would play with dwarfs. The Spanish court had a fascination with dwarfs and people with physical abnormalities, probably because they made the royals feel normal by comparison. Charles felt comfortable with them. They were his only real friends. He was incredibly superstitious. He believed that if he touched a corpse, he might get some of its energy. So, when his relatives died, he would have the coffins opened so he could look at them and touch them. At one point, he had the rotting bodies of his ancestors dug up so he could lie down next to them. He spent hours lying in the crypt next to his father and his first wife. Just soaking in the vibes. It's a very goth image. The last of the Habsburgs, lying in the dark with the dead, because he felt more at home with them than the living. But the tragedy of Charles wasn't just his health. It was his duty. His one job, the only job a king really has, was to produce an heir. To keep the line going. So, they married him off. First, they married him to Marie-Louise of Orleans. She was a French princess. Beautiful, lively, intelligent. She was the niece of Louis XIV. When she was told she had to marry Charles, she wept. She begged not to go. She knew what he was. She called him the monster. But royal duty calls. She was packed off to Madrid. When they met, Charles actually fell in love with her. In his own simple, confused way, he adored her. He'd never had a beautiful woman pay attention to him before. But Marie-Louise was miserable. The Spanish court was rigid. It was illegal for anyone to touch the queen. She couldn't laugh. She couldn't look out the window. She was trapped in a golden cage with a husband who couldn't chew his dinner. And the pressure was on her. Give us a son. But Charles was, well, biologically incapable. The autopsy later would reveal that his reproductive organs were basically withered raisins. But they didn't know that then. Or they refused to admit it. So they blamed her. Obviously. It's always the woman's fault in the 17th century. They gave her fertility treatments that were horrifying. Potions made of crushed beetles. Enemas. Prayers to specific saints. They forced her to go on pilgrimages. Marie-Louise became depressed. She started eating to comfort herself. She grew quite large. And then, at the age of 26, she died suddenly. Probably from appendicitis, or maybe from one of the treatments the doctors gave her. Charles was devastated. He cried for days. He was totally lost without her. But the machinery of the state didn't care about his grief. They needed an heir. The clock was ticking. So, barely weeks after the funeral, they married him again. This time to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Maria Anna was different. She wasn't a tragic, weeping flower. She was a German powerhouse. She was one of 23 children. Her family was famous for being incredibly fertile. The Spanish thought, okay, if anyone can get a baby out of this situation, it's her. Maria Anna arrived in Madrid and took one look at Charles and realized the situation was hopeless. She realized she was never going to be the mother of a king. So, she decided to be the boss instead. She dominated Charles. She had temper tantrums. She smashed vases. She stole artwork and sent it back to her family in Germany. She realized the ship was sinking, and she was going to loot the buffet before it went down. Charles was terrified of her. He would hide in his room to avoid her. Meanwhile, the sorcery theories ramped up. The king wasn't producing an heir, so clearly, someone had hexed his equipment. The king's confessor, a priest named Froilan Diaz, decided to get to the bottom of it. He started conducting exorcisms on the king. But he also did something else. He reached out to other exorcists across Europe. He found a monk in a convent in Asturias who claimed that some demons had spoken to him. According to the demons, who are apparently reliable sources of medical information, Charles had been bewitched when he was 14. The spell had been put in a cup of chocolate. The ingredients of the spell were the brains of a dead man to take away his will, the intestines to take away his health, and the kidneys to take away his fertility. It sounds like a very unappetizing smoothie. It was a comforting thought for the poor. It was the one area where they had total equality with the rich. They also believed in purgatory. This was a holding pen for souls who weren't good enough for heaven but not bad enough for hell, which was basically everyone. In purgatory, you had to be purged of your sins by fire before you could go upstairs. The amount of time you spent there depended on how many sins you had and how many people were praying for you. This created a spiritual economy. If you were rich, you could pay a priest to say Mass for your soul every day for 100 years. You could build a chapel. You could basically bribe your way out of purgatory. The peasants couldn't afford that. They had to rely on their family remembering them. So, they formed guilds or fraternities. These were like social clubs/insurance policies. You paid a small subscription fee. If you fell into poverty, the guild would help you. If your house burned down, they'd help you rebuild. And most importantly, when you died, the guild would pay for your funeral and ensure that prayers were said for your soul. It was crowd-funded salvation. It shows that even in a world that seemed designed to crush them, the peasants found ways to look after each other. They built their own safety nets when the lords and the king failed to provide them. Let's imagine floating through a village graveyard at night. No perfectly manicured lawns. Just mounds of earth. Maybe a wooden cross, long since rotted away. The churchyard wasn't just for the dead, though. It was a public space. Markets were held there. People played games there. They grazed their sheep among the graves. The dead were still part of the community. They were just resting. As we move into the 15th century, the medieval world is slowly, creakily transforming. The feudal system is breaking down. The Renaissance is starting to wake up down in Italy, fueled by money and art and rediscovering those old Greek books. But up here in the mud, life is still hard. But it's changing. The houses are getting a little better. Some peasants, the yeomen, are starting to build houses with actual chimneys. Imagine that. Smoke going out of the house instead of into your eyes. Pure luxury. They're starting to eat more meat. They're drinking better ale. They're wearing slightly more colorful clothes, laws be damned. The Little Ice Age is approaching, which will make the winters colder and the summers shorter. But humanity is stubborn. We adapt. We complain, but we adapt. We've floated through the famine, the plague, the revolt, and the daily grind. We've looked at their teeth, their taxes, and their toilets. It's a lot to take in. It makes our modern problems, slow Wi-Fi, traffic jams, the coffee shop getting your order wrong, seem a little less catastrophic. At least you don't have to give your best cow to the landlord when your dad dies. At least you don't have to wash your shirt in urine. Well, you can if you want to, I guess. No one is stopping you. But you have options. So, as we leave the medieval peasant to his rest on his straw mattress, surrounded by his family and his livestock, let's take a deep breath. The world is quiet. The fire is just embers now. The ox is chewing its cud. The church bell tolls the hour in the distance. We can leave them there. In the past. A past that built the present. A past full of misery, yes, but also resilience. And we can float on. To other times. To other strange lives. In the next part, we might leave the muddy fields behind and head to the shiny, treacherous courts of the Renaissance. Where people smell better, maybe, but were much more likely to stab you in the back with a jeweled dagger. But that's a story for another night. For now, just listen to the silence. The absence of the hue and cry. The absence of the bailiff. Just peace. The genetic cul-de-sac of the Habsburgs. So, we've spent a lot of time in the mud. And honestly, the mud wasn't great. It was cold, it smelled like livestock, and the taxes were terrible. But here is the strange thing about history. Sometimes, being at the bottom of the pile is actually safer than being at the very, very top. The peasants we just left behind had a diverse gene pool. They married the girl from the next village, or the boy from across the river. Their family trees looked like trees, lots of branches spreading out in healthy directions. But now, I want to float us away from the thatched cottages and the turnip fields. We're going to drift south, across the Pyrenees, to the sun-baked plains of Spain in the late 17th century. We are going to the royal court of Madrid. How medieval peasants survived plagues, famine, and lords. Hey guys. Tonight, we begin with a journey back to a time when running water usually just meant a river, and healthcare was mostly just hoping you didn't wake up dead. So, go ahead and dim the lights. Get comfortable. Let the worries of the modern world just float away. Because compared to what we're about to talk about, your day was probably just fine. We usually spend our time here discussing kings with too many chins and queens whose family trees look like wreaths. You know, the people with the gold crowns and the genetic disorders. But tonight, I want to shift our focus downwards. Way downwards. We're going to look at the people who grew the food for those Habsburg jaws. The peasants. They didn't have genealogies that looked like pretzels. They mostly just had mud. And taxes. And then more mud. Roughly 90% of the population in medieval Europe fell into this category. They were the background noise of history. The extras in the movie who don't even get a credit, but who end up doing all the actual work. Surviving as a peasant wasn't about winning glorious battles. It was about managing a chronic, low-level state of misery for about 40 years, if you were lucky. It was an endurance sport where the prize was just waking up again tomorrow to do the exact same thing you did today. So, let's just float into their daily reality. Imagine waking up before the sun. Every single day. Not because you have a flight to catch or because you want to squeeze in a morning workout. You wake up because if you don't plow the east field today, you might starve next winter. It's a pretty good motivator, starvation. Most of these folks lived under what historians call the manorial system, which is a very dry way of saying they were owned, more or less, by a local lord. Let's call him Baron Reginald the slightly damp. Baron Reginald lived in the big stone house on the hill, the one with actual windows. You lived down in the village, in a house made of sticks and mud. If you were a serf, which was the bottom rung of the peasant ladder, the basement level of society, really, you were basically part of the real estate. You couldn't leave the land without Reginald's permission. And Reginald wasn't going to give it, because who else was going to harvest his wheat for free? You were tied to the soil. In a very literal sense. You were born there, you worked there, and eventually, you became part of the fertilizer there. Let's talk about their dream homes for a moment. We're usually talking about wattle-and-daub, which is a fancy architectural term for weaving some sticks together, that's the wattle, and then slapping a mixture of mud, straw, and, well, animal manure onto it to seal the gaps. That's the daub. Because why waste good manure on the fields when you can paint your living room walls with it? The roof was thatched with straw, which was great for keeping some of the rain out, but also excellent at housing legions of bugs, spiders, and rats that would just occasionally drop onto your face while you slept. It really brought you closer to nature. Inside, the floor was dirt, just packed down hard by generations of feet. And usually damp. Because of course it was. It wasn't exactly open-concept living, but it was certainly communal. In the winter, to keep from freezing to death, you'd bring the valuable animals inside with you. The milk cow. Maybe a couple of pigs. Some chickens roosting in the rafters. So, your one-room house smelled like smoke from the open fire in the center, unwashed bodies, and wet livestock. It was a very distinct medieval aroma. There was no chimney, by the way. Just a hole in the roof. So the smoke just sort of hung around at eye level, which probably explains why everyone in medieval art looks slightly squinted. Furniture was minimal. A trestle table you could lean against the wall when you weren't using it. Maybe a stool if you were fancy. A chest to keep your one other tunic in. The bed was usually just a straw mattress on the floor that everyone piled onto together for warmth. It's cozy if your definition of cozy involves sharing a pillow with grandpa and a goat. Now, the workday. It was long. It started at dawn and ended when you couldn't see your hand in front of your face anymore. The farming methods were, let's call them, inefficient. They didn't have modern fertilizers or tractors. They had a wooden plow tipped with a bit of iron, if they were lucky. And they had an ox. Or maybe just their neighbors helping them pull it. It was backbreaking, slow, monotonous work. You spent your life walking behind an animal, staring at its backside, praying for rain, and then immediately praying for the rain to stop so the seeds wouldn't rot. It was a delicate balance of agricultural anxiety. And here is the truly fun part about being a peasant under the manorial system. You didn't just work your own little strip of land to feed your family. Oh no. That would be too simple. Depending on the local customs of whatever fiefdom you were stuck in, you owed the Lord, Baron Reginald, labor. It was called boon work. Which sounds almost cheerful, doesn't it? Like a favor you do for a friend. It wasn't. It meant that for 2 or 3 days a week, you had to leave your own crops unattended to go work Reginald's personal fields. The domain lands. And naturally, Reginald needed you most during peak times, like harvest or plowing season. Exactly when you needed to be working your own land.